In our previous lecture, we studied the history of writing. We looked at mythic and scientific ideas about the origins of language and writing. And I noted that language itself, language and the creation of writing, could be the subject of myth. And many ancient stories were told about this. Today, we move to literary and religious aspects of myth, and we will survey some of the more helpful approaches to the study of this subject. And I say more helpful because there are many approaches. This is a big subject in the academy. How do we understand? What methods do we use to understand the myths of the ancients? One thing that theorists speak about is the method of myth. Unlike modern methods of storytelling, the methods of myth are fixed and exhibit little change. They're very linear. We'll identify some of these methods and illustrate them with examples. And this will lead us to the question of the meaning of myths. For the way in which these myths are told, they're slow-moving, they're repetitive, there's only one narrative at a time, have led scholars to speculate about the relationship between this form, this slow-moving, repetitive, one-narrative form, and the function that these myths had in any given society. We will then move to a discussion of myth and ritual, a topic taken up by many scholars of myth, both in folklore studies and in anthropology. And this is a subject that often centers on the myths and rituals of the ancient Near East. Of course, there were other myths and rituals studied, those of the Greeks and Romans, those of the civilizations of Eastern Asia. But myth and ritual scholars tend to focus on our material. And we'll conclude with an outline of the psychological approach to myths. You will recall that in my introductory lecture, I outlined 4 approaches to the question of myth. How might we study it, and in what way should we approach it? And what I intend to do in this lecture is, based on the material that we covered in the past lectures, return to those 4 approaches and see how they might be applied to specific stories. So I'm beginning with the theory. There are these 4 theoretical approaches to myth. We've had some time together to actually look at stories. Let's go back and see, do these theories apply? The theories must be tested. Much as in our story of the king of Egypt who wanted to test his theory of whether Egyptian was the original language. Well, he tested it by putting those 2 poor kids in seclusion. Let us test our theories. The first, which is generally called myth as ancient science, tells us that stories explain natural and human phenomenon. And I think this is what many of us get in our general educations. Why did the ancient peoples have myths? Well, they had things they couldn't explain. We can explain everything, we think, so we don't need myths. And that's an approach that's very familiar to me when I teach this subject. The brightest college kids will tell me, well, myth is something of the past because now we have science. Science replaces myth. When I remind them of Star Wars or Harry Potter, they can see that myth still exists in a new form in a scientific age. But let us return to this idea that myth explains things now explained scientifically. One thing that needed to be explained in the ancient world was illness, and of course, the all too frequent consequence of illness, death. What is the origin of illness? Why do people get sick? And of course, the question of why do they die? Now, among the Mesopotamian cultures, there was a dual attitude, which I think on reflection is quite practical. They had some medicines, some remedies, which could restore you to health. We would think of them as herbal remedies. And then they had rituals, which could cure illness, or they believed that could cure illness. We would think of these as magical practices. Now, these 2 approaches were often fused. A very charming one that I enjoy reading, although I don't enjoy the illness that it speaks about, has been called by its translator a cosmological incantation on toothache. This tries to explain why our teeth hurt. They didn't know about gum disease, cavities, and the poor care of teeth, so they needed a naturalistic explanation, but one that also had a cosmological, magical aspect to it. The great thing about this text is that it explains where toothaches come from, and while explaining it, it interjects a line to the dentist. So you do two things. It's much like the idea of God helps those who help themselves. You have to have the magic to deal with the toothache and the explanation, but you also need to go to the dentist. And they did have dentists. This phrase, a cosmological incantation on toothache, is the translator's phrase, of course. A reminder, these ancient texts did not have titles. When we read them in an anthology, in some of the books I've suggested in our bibliography, they'll have titles. But like many poems, the title is simply the first line of the text or something that a translator assigns to it. The other thing that these texts don't have are authors. We don't know who wrote them. It's very rare that we have the name of a writer. And of course, this is very odd for our sensibilities because the two things we know about a book, about a text, who wrote it and what its name is. That's how we speak about it. That's how we purchase it. But that's not the way they approach texts. On toothache, after Anu had created heaven, this is a reference to the great God of heaven, heaven had created the earth had created the rivers had created the canals had created the marsh, and the marsh had created the worm. Allow me to interject in this ancient text. Notice this idea of creation, one of their many ideas. The heaven God engineers the creation of the first order of things, and then each order, in descending order, creates the next thing. So you have existence itself creating another realm of existence, until finally we get to the worm. The worm is created. The worm wept, weeping before Shamash. Shamash is the sun god. His tears flowing before Ea, Ea also known as Enki, the god of wisdom and organization. The worm is speaking, "What wilt thou give me for my food? What wilt thou give me for my sucking?" And the god answers, "I shall give thee the ripe fig and the apricot." Of what use are they to me, the ripe fig and the apricot? Lift me up among the teeth, and among the gums cause me to dwell. The blood of the tooth I will suck, and of the gum I will gnaw its roots. And here, there's an interjection to the dentist. Fix the pin and seize its foot. So some technical explanation and advice is offered. Now we return to the conversation between the god and the worm. Because thou hast said this, O worm, may Ea smite thee with the might of his hand. Well, here we have a great example of myth as ancient science. Let's explain a phenomenon, but we don't only explain it, we tell you what to do about it. We can use the text, it's an incantation, to effect cure, to effect change. But let's have some insurance. While you're doing that, let the dentist know what to do. Eminently practical. These societies are often described as mysterious. This is a late-night TV idea we often hear. The mysterious ancient world. They are not mysterious. They had different ways of thinking about things, organizing things, and explaining things. But it wasn't mystery. It was very practical in their own terms. But let us move to another way of approaching myth, that myth reflects historical reality, but in some form other than narrative history. We know of Gilgamesh. I've spoken about him a few times. He will be one of the core figures in our series. And we know something about him historically. He ruled the Sumerian city-state of Uruk in the 27th century BC. That is between 2700 and 2600. We know he was a great warrior. He's remembered for defending and fortifying his city. The texts tell us again and again, he built the city walls. This was his accomplishment. Now, after his death, his memory passes into myth. There's a process. This is a process we're all familiar with in the modern world, where figures, celebrities, politicians, rock stars, become mythic figures. In the ancient Near East, it took 1,000 years for this to happen. In the contemporary world, it might take 2 years. The mythic guitarist who left us 2 years ago, this is something you often hear. But the process is similar, just the speed is different. Gilgamesh, 1,000 years after his actual death. So now let's fast forward to 1600 BC, not 2600 BC. In that era, we have the emergence of texts which will finally be codified, organized, and they decide upon what is within the text. By about 1300 BC, we have a full epic of Gilgamesh. So we begin with short, somewhat formulaic accounts of Gilgamesh by the Sumerians, and this develops into an epic account in the Akkadian language. Now, through this retelling, the Akkadians were trying to achieve something politically. They were connecting themselves to an ancient hero, to ancient history, as rulers and politicians often do. They were gaining a certain kind of legitimacy for it. So Gilgamesh, who's the figure of an earlier culture of the Sumerians, in a later culture becomes an icon. And his story in two senses, the story of him historically and the mythic representation of his rule, reminds us of this connection between history and myth. Let us then move to a myth and ritual approach. This emphasizes the religious function of narrative. Myths can provide the words for rituals, and the rituals become a primary phenomenon of the culture. The ritual, enacted regularly, ties the community together. We could relate this to the whole idea of religion, which comes from the word religio, binding, tying together. The function of religious ritual is to form community and to keep it together. For scholars who teach, write about, and theorize about this myth and ritual approach, myth is not a literary artifact, but something that enables the performance of a communal act. Let us apply this to a biblical text, to the Psalms. These theorists see the Psalms as a text used in ritual. Let us be more specific. The dedication of the Temple of Solomon, there were specific psalms used at that dedication. In later eras of the Temple, this rededication was evoked through the use of psalms. Now, the myth and ritual approach doesn't claim that other approaches cannot be used at the same time. It is not exclusive, and that is something I'd like to emphasize about all of these four approaches. They're not mutually exclusive. These theorists would admit that for most people, the Psalms are not ritual texts, but rather they are texts which serve for purposes of inspiration or consolation. And that is the way these texts are used today in synagogues and churches. People read them on sad and happy occasions, individually and communally. And I think we could say that many secular people who read the Psalms out of the context of the church or the synagogue would also take them to be inspiration or consolation.